This is a recording from a Sunday meeting of the BC Humanist Association in Vancouver. Humanism is a progressive worldview that, without supernaturalism, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead meaningful, ethical lives capable of adding to the greater good of humanity. To learn more about humanism and to support our work, visit bchumanist.ca and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and be sure to subscribe to the BC Humanist podcast. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of our staff or board of directors.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the introduction, Dan, and thank you, Ian, and your whole organization for inviting me here today to talk about the Tenants Union. It's a pleasure, and particularly a pleasure to come to the Humanists and speak to you. My first encounter with the Humanists, I think, was at a Word on the Street festival many years ago. They changed the name now, but it was a delight to find that such an organization existed in British Columbia and linked up with organizations worldwide because, so before I want to talk about the tenants, I just want to appreciate the work that you all do for humanism and for pluralism and a secular society, because we're essentially living under, de facto global blasphemy laws in many ways now, and we live here in Vancouver under such a diverse society with so many different faith communities, non-faith communities. It's very crucial that we defend the true values of secularism and pluralism, and they come under attack in ways we wouldn't expect. So this organization is vital. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and how I came to be a volunteer organizer with the Tenants Union, because we have no staff. And actually, we're not even 5 months old. It just feels like we've been around forever already. The organization was founded April 29th, but I'll get to that and how I really had no intention of taking on another activist commitment. I just turned 40. I'm already very engaged in a number of issues. I do a lot of work in independent media. I'm a volunteer editor with Ricochet Media and have been involved in the anti-war movement and many other social justice causes. So we have 2 little kids. I'm getting to be middle-aged. It's the time you're supposed to take on less activist commitments. But we live in Vancouver. And my partner's the same. She comes from an activist background and also has been thinking how do I take on a few less things and focus on getting the kids to school and getting to work. But the Tenants Union kind of came to us because it just came out of our experience trying to live and trying to stay in Vancouver, really. Our older son is six and a half now. We've moved 6 times in the 6 years he's been alive. One of those was an internal move. When he was born, we lived in a kind of like a bachelor suite in a co-op downtown. 500 square feet or something, 450 square feet. So one of the moves was internal to a 1.5 bedroom in that co-op. It's a great co-op, but unfortunately, because they built it downtown, it's one of the co-ops that basically had no family-sized units. So we had to move out of that co-op pretty quickly. We briefly tried living in Richmond. We found a semi-affordable rental unit in Richmond that was more than big enough for us, that had 3 bedrooms. But we couldn't hack the commuting and all the transit to get to our jobs and to all of our activities down in the city. So we then lived in Yaletown for about 1.5 years, again in a semi-affordable, nonprofit-run building. There's actually quite a bit of affordable housing hiding in neighborhoods like Yaletown and Cole Harbour, where you wouldn't expect it. Anyway, then we had a second son, and so we were too big for that apartment, and finally we ended up in Fairview, and now we have a reasonably sized place in a nonprofit-owned. We're still paying market rent, but a nonprofit-owned rental complex. And it's geared towards families. So there's a lot of 3-bedroom places where we live now. Now our only concern is that the owners of the property are going to make a deal with a developer, and we're all going to get pushed along or moved out somewhere else. So we're temporarily properly housed, but there's still this anxiety. And that's how we came across the idea of starting the Vancouver Tenants Union. I think probably thousands of people had the idea that we needed something like a tenants union, at least subconsciously. And early this year, early 2017, some organizers in the downtown east side who had been primarily fighting slumlords who were literally letting their buildings fall apart and refusing to uphold the maintenance bylaws to upkeep those buildings. They had been organizing and successfully, getting their issues in the media, pressuring the city to come down harder on the slumlords and either fix the buildings up or condemn the buildings and get people in proper housing. So some of our friends in the downtown east side started talking to people in different neighborhoods, finding a lot of horror stories from tenants in the West End. We live in Fairview, so we got neighbors together in Fairview, had conversations, people in East Van, people really all over the city. So sometime in February or March, we decided to get together and start having meetings of people just we call ourselves tenant organizers. Essentially, people who live in a rental building or in a rental unit who want to get together with other tenants and fight for better conditions, fight against rent increases, and in many cases, fight against rent evictions. So that's how the idea of the Tenants Union sort of coalesced. And on April 29th, we launched, like I said, less than 5 months old, not really knowing what the public response would be. And we booked a room at the church at 12th and Main. And anyway, it was the cheapest venue we could find. It was like a $100 an hour rental for a nice space that fit 200 people. There's one other point about how I got involved in this effort. Like I said, we're already kind of to the max in the types of things we can get involved with. But the initial organizers who convened these meetings of tenants from throughout the city to talk about this idea, these meetings happened in February and March, they organized childcare and they paid someone to provide childcare at the meetings. So our family probably never would have gone to those initial organizing meetings. But the key organizer said, no, we have childcare here. Come on down, you get a couple hours off. The organizers provided coffee. People came and brought snacks and food. So it was just a really healthy space to go where families could go, where people could be caffeinated and keep their blood sugar up while they discussed what to do and how to organize. So yeah, a great lesson for starting any kind of organization. Always have some donuts and coffee for sure. And I see Ian and Dan already know that organizing trick. So the Tenants Union decides to launch. By the way, we picked the date of the launch and then realized it was 2 weeks before a provincial election. And all of our kind of friends who would normally come along to these things were understandably busy. I won't editorialize about the election because I know it's a charitable organization you have here. But we just realized this was maybe a mistake to do this in the middle of, 2 weeks at the end of an election campaign. We just figured the turnout might not be so good. We got there that evening to set up the room, and people were already showing up and kind of asking how they could join. And, usually the crowd, if your meeting starts at 7 o'clock, usually the crowd starts to trickle in at 5 to 7 or at 7 o'clock. But, by 6:30, we were already getting a good number of people in the room, including people I didn't recognize. So that was a positive sign. Ended up, the room was full. We had, close to 200 people there. I think about 200 people. We had a little childcare set up right in the main hall. So we had kids playing and all kinds of tenants got up and just told their stories. That was really the main thing we did at our first big public meeting. We just had a roll call of people telling horror stories, but it turned out not to be depressing, because when people are telling their tenant horror stories together, they really get empowered and they have a kind of moral and strength. There's a kind of moral strength in the room, and I think it really bolstered people, and even people who shared very personal details of their horror stories as tenants, I think felt good and comfortable doing so. So that was the launch of the Tenants Union. We didn't try to influence that election other than just to talk about the policies we wanted to see in general. And that's kind of the Tenants Union approach, and we'll continue, even though there's been a change of government, we'll continue the same approach. So what does the Vancouver Tenants Union want, and what do we advocate for? We have a policy working group set up that, and luckily we have some lawyers on board. And this was very important right away. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. But one of the things about the success of that first public meeting we did was that we were not at all ready in terms of our capacity as a group to handle the requests for support. So we had 200 people show up at the meeting. We put out our website. We put out our social media. We got all kinds of media coverage, which was very surprising because of the other things going on in Vancouver and BC at the time. So people were just messaging us on Facebook, sending us emails, some people just asking how they could join, but most people were writing for help, either advice or more sort of labor-intensive help. And we realized that first week after the public meeting that this was going to be a real challenge, just to keep up with the requests people were hitting us with. So the first thing we did was not plan any additional forums or public actions. We just had to figure out as a group how could we best provide assistance to all the people messaging us. And a lot of the times it's just a matter of referring people to existing organizations. I don't want to give you the impression that the Vancouver Tenants Union is the first time tenants have had any support. There is a tenants office, a tenants' right advocacy committee with a staff person who can take on some of these questions. There's, of course, the residential tenancy branch where you can take complaints. But a lot of times it's just a matter of tenants not understanding their own legal rights. And what happens is you're in your building, maybe it's just a basement suite, and everything's going fine for a few years, and then all of a sudden the house gets sold, or there's a stress in your landlord's life, and they start taking it out on the tenant. Something comes up really quickly, or you live in a building, and all of a sudden you get an eviction notice or a vacate notice because they're going to renovate and up the rents. People really panic if they don't know their rights or they don't feel supported. You can imagine in your own life all the things you have to take care of. If all of a sudden you have to figure out how to fight your landlord, you might decide just to cash in your chips and start looking for another place. So many of those first contacts, it's just a matter of telling someone, well, your landlord is breaking the law. Let's just take a second. Don't let them get away with this. Don't sign the fixed term lease they're trying to get you to sign, or don't move out. Don't give in, and here are some of the steps you can take. So one of the first things we did then was get in touch with people who had legal background or were lawyers who had. I think we have one or two lawyers who have gone to the bar and practicing. One or two practicing lawyers and a couple other people with a legal degree or a lot of legal research education. So we have an advocacy committee that has been working quietly. In most cases quietly. Most cases haven't gone public, but have been supporting a lot of tenants. In some cases, just getting larger settlements for people who are being moved out of buildings that are getting redeveloped. You may not every time are you going to get to stay in your home. The redevelopment may go through, but tenants can be much better compensated if they're organized and if they have legal advice. So we had our legal advocacy committee set up. This is one thing we did. We also started to talk about what are the big public campaigns, what are the big public issues we want to raise. So I would say the biggest one is fixing the Provincial Residential Tenancy Act and getting a number of loopholes that landlords have been taking advantage of closed. And the other thing I should say is we realized right away our strength was going to be in numbers. we were not going to get big funding from any organization and be able to hire staff and have a really slick operation. We realized we're a bunch of volunteers trying to start an organization. The key thing we need are other volunteers like us, but they need to be people who are making a certain commitment. So we decided to be a membership-based organization. We decided to charge membership dues, but because we are precarious tenants trying to organize other tenants, we set our membership fee ridiculously low. I argued against this, so I'll just be clear. The membership fee starts at $1 a year, and I thought we should at least suggest $5 a year, or even $5 a month, just to get the idea out there that if you can afford a little bit, it's well worth it. And because we're signing up hundreds and hundreds of people, it's a bit of a missed opportunity if we let everyone pay $1. But, fortunately, and so how we ended up doing it was saying membership is $1. If you want to be a sustaining member, you can either, or just a financial supporter. If you're someone who lives in a co-op or someone who owns their home, we invite monthly contributions from supporters. And I, for one, encourage sustaining members, if you can afford it, to pay $20 or $50 or $100 a year. That kind of recurring funding is essential to an organization functioning. So what we did for the launch meeting was your membership comes with benefits. We had these little membership kits. We use Ziploc bags. I know it's not ideal for the environment, right? But we had a general meeting last night, so I ran out of most of my materials because we had more people than we were expecting. But I have this membership kit from the very first meeting, so I can pass it around so you see what you get. And if anyone does want to sign up, of course, we'll figure out how to do that after this meeting. So first, you get a little basic information card about the top demands, and these are the main things we decided to focus on before we developed a policy committee that started a laundry list. So we decided the main things to focus on are: we want to have a contact person or a tenant organizer in every rental building in the city. So just start small, right? So this is our goal, what we're working towards. So if someone signs up as a member, we also ask them, would you like to be the contact person in your building? That doesn't mean that you're that you have office hours all week and you're responsible for a whole bunch of stuff. It just means you're willing to share with the rest of the tenants union any issues that come up in your building, and just willing to be a contact person. So we're looking for that. Really, it means every rental building of a certain size, 20 units or more or something. If you live in a basement suite and so many, or a laneway house, so many renters are in, traditional single-family homes, we ask people if they'd be willing to work as a contact for their kind of block or their sub-neighborhood. Basically, if you're willing to take on responsibility beyond yourself, we'll consider you a tenant organizer, and we want to build this network right across the whole city. And, we have maps on Nation Builder, and we're working towards the ambitious goal of having a tenant organizer in every building, which might not be as crazy as it sounds, but I'll get to that because I want to talk about that later. We also want to create a force of renters with thousands of dues-paying members. We're close to that goal. We have about 800 members right now. We want to change policy to benefit tenants, obvious. Organize tenants to protect them from threats, intimidation, and bribes that lead to the loss of their homes. Because, as I say, part of the battle is just knowing you have strength in numbers behind you for that initial moment or that initial day where you have a problem with a landlord. To empower tenants through tenants' rights education and advocacy training. So the other part of it is empowering tenants themselves so that, if a tenant is really educated about their rights or about the RTB rules and about what a landlord can get away with, they won't even need to contact the tenants union. This will just become a culture of tenants' rights. And the thing about intimidation is very real. I don't know if anyone's had the experience, but I once moved out of a place in the West End when I was in my 20s, living with my partner down in the West End, and we committed a very minor. No, we didn't commit a. Sorry, a minor act of resistance to the landlord or the property manager. The landlord was the company Hollyburn, which is a big one, right? You see their H logo all over town. Hollyburn is the landlord. The property managers who lived in the building were this couple that we always got along with. There were no problems. They did the maintenance work, and there was no big problems. But then there was a bed bug issue in the building, and a bunch of people who had the bed bugs moved out of their suite, and it was a problem. We never had them in our unit, but they were moving people in, and it was obvious they weren't telling people. We talked to someone who was moving in, if they had asked about bed bugs and what they had been told. So the property managers were misleading new tenants. So one day I went and printed off a little sign that said, "There are bed bugs in this building," kind of thing. I just put up a sign in the elevators, and the property manager guessed that it was me, I guess, or maybe she did this to everybody. But there was a couple that were the property managers, but she came to my door one morning, caught me before I had even had coffee, kind of thing. So I was like, "Who's knocking on the door?" "Oh, okay. Well, I wonder why she's come to talk to me." And I can't remember if there was a threat of physical violence, but she said something along the lines of, "If you don't move out, we're going to make your life very, very difficult." And I was just like, at first I didn't even know why she was saying it, and then she alluded to these signs, and someone told her that I had put them up, we had been talking about it. Anyway, long story short, we did not feel like living in this building anymore, and we didn't know anyone who would help us report this threat or organize ourselves to fight back. So, and this is almost 15 years ago, so you could still consider the possibility of moving and finding another place you could afford. And we didn't have kids, so it wasn't that hard for us to move, but it was still very stressful. And we basically caved into the intimidation. So you can imagine if people are in a more precarious situation, what effect on their lives that kind of intimidation has. So that's just to say, that's why we included the thing about intimidation. So I was saying we at first decided the big impact we wanted to have was on the provincial level policies, and specifically around the rental and tenancy agreement, and the RTB in general. Essentially, most things that affect the rate of rent increases and rental conditions in general, rent control such as we have it, are controlled by the province. There's a lot of things the city can do, and like I said, we're developing a laundry list, but we decided to focus on the provincial level stuff. Not because of the provincial election, we were too late starting to really influence that anyway, but we wanted to just put a focus on those issues. A few of the big ones are, in British Columbia, the rent control such as it exists, and basically landlords are allowed to raise the rent by 2%. And many of you, I'm sure, know this. If you rent 2% plus the rate of inflation. So this coming year, it's going to be a 4% increase. You may have already got that notice in your mail or under your door. The thing is, landlords have a lot of ways to increase it much more than 4%, and that's why Vancouver now has a rental rates that are just completely off the charts. I think just a few days ago, you may have seen a new report found that the average one-bedroom home in Vancouver is now $2,020 a month. That is the average rent. So we calculated that if someone was working, basically if you were working for minimum wage full-time, you couldn't pay that rent, even if you did nothing else. If you were a single person wanting to rent an average one-bedroom apartment, working minimum wage full-time would not cut it. So it's already way out of control. There's a 4% increase allowed each year, but landlords have all these ways where they can astronomically increase the rent. And one of the big ones is rent evictions. Another big one is they get tenants to sign a fixed-term lease, and essentially those include a vacate clause. So if you sign a fixed-term 1-year lease, 12 months, they can just get rid of you and find another tenant after that and increase the rent, or they can ask you to sign another one and basically keep you in that cycle and increasing the rent more than they should be. The renoviction stuff, there is a lot the city can do on renovictions. We want landlords they do have to file permits with the city when they're doing renovations. But we essentially want a system at the city where landlords have to prove that the renovations are actually necessary. Right now, it's kind of like it's just a matter of filling out the papers and saying you're going to do something and here's what the rent is going to be before and after kind of thing. The landlord should have to prove, one, that the renovations are necessary, and the city's inspections department should be more vigorous in checking on this stuff. And also, they should have to prove that they're actually making improvements that would justify any rent increase. Some people want to actually push for rules where they have to, before any renovations get done, they have to sign a contract with all tenants saying the tenants are going to get to go back at the same rates. Another way of doing it is they could charge higher rates after the renovations are done, but only if they can prove that they've actually increased the cost of the building. They've actually increased the quality of the building. They've actually made tangible renovations. Because what's happening with so many of these renovations, especially in the West End, a lot of the older buildings, and a lot of the long-term tenants, they're getting booted out for so-called renovations. Sometimes the landlord is immediately putting the place on Craigslist, either as an Airbnb rental, or they're just advertising it on Craigslist for way higher rent to new people. And what they end up doing is, slapping a coat of paint on and then renting the suite back and saying, oh, it's a renovated suite. Now it's a $2,500 suite instead of a $1,500 suite. So there's a lot of need at both the city and the provincial level to crack down on renovictions. What else? We have a huge list. So let's just go through a bit of what the provincial government could do differently. And this is what we have: a policy committee. We have an advocacy and outreach committee, and that's basically where those are the people who will either be the lawyers or get you in touch with the lawyers you need. We also have a policy committee. And then we have sort of a committee that is a network of dedicated building reps. So people who have said, I'll be the tenant organizer in my building. Those people, in some cases, have taken up to 5. I think there might be one person who's taken 10. They're the tenant organizer for 10 buildings. So they're like responsible and they have contacts in each of those buildings. I only have 2 buildings. So I have my own complex and then kind of a sister building with the same owners and run by the same property managers. That's just a few doors down in our neighborhood in Fairview. So I'm the tenant organizer for about 45 units, and I don't know how many people, 150 tenants, including kids or something. So I've taken on 2 buildings. So we have a committee of building organizers that sort of stays in touch. And your main thing you try to do as a building organizer is you're available and listening for any big problems, so you can refer tenants in your buildings for the kind of help they need. But really, at this point, since we're 5 months old, we're looking for other people who are willing to be the tenant organizer in their building. So we're really just recruiting other building organizers at this point. But anyway, I'm not on the policy committee, but they have drawn up this incredible list of changes we would like to see at both the city and the provincial level to make Vancouver a more tenant-friendly city. And I should say, it's not; these are not pie-in-the-sky things. People who move to Vancouver from Montreal, for example, they think we're completely out of our minds that we've allowed things to get to this state in Vancouver. In Montreal, if your landlord wants to increase your rent, they have to go to a sort of a tribunal or a arbitration, and they have to make the case. They have to justify why your rent is being increased. So they have to go before I don't know if it's a panel or one adjudicator or something, and they have to say like, well, I'm putting in a new toilet or I'm replacing the bathroom floors in my tenant's suite. Therefore, I need to increase the rent. And, in Montreal, they're talking about apartments that rent for $800 or a basement suite that's $400. I have colleagues on this work project that live in a co-op in Montreal, and they pay $300 rent. And the co-op is paid off. Their rent is going to be $300 for the rest of their lives, and they just can't understand why we don't all move to Montreal. But anyway, our lives are here, and we have models. Yeah, exactly. No, there are reasons, obviously, of that Vancouver's rent is higher. It's not just about government policy. It's obviously about a zero vacancy or a close to zero vacancy, a lack of affordable housing supply, and money and people from all over the world and all over Canada end up in Vancouver or want to end up in Vancouver. So it's not to suggest that we're going to get to a situation where it's as affordable as a city like Montreal, which has its charms, but also has its winters. But we do have models from other cities. We have models from tenant organizers in the United States that we can follow and advocate for here. So not to bore you with a laundry list of policy, and I definitely want to have time to hear your questions and hear any of your stories if you are tenants here. What we want the province to do is, we'd like them to cancel next year's rent increases. We always ask for the big ones, and then if they cut the rent increases in half, we'll be happy with that. And there is some word from apparently the housing minister is considering looking at the annual allowable increase, and maybe not even doing the 4%, but that has been announced. We want that brought down, at least temporarily, to give people some relief, because the rents have increased so astronomically over the last decade. What we're saying is, for a few years at least, stop the annual increases. So here our policy committee has suggested a 5-year sort of freeze of the increases, and then after that you could go back to inflation or interest rates only for increases. We want to have a regional rental rollback over the period relative to the RTB-approved maximum annual increases. We want to tie rental rates to the unit rather than the tenant. That's the other big problem with the RTA in British Columbia, is that 4% increase is not for the unit, it's for the tenant. So this gives landlord a big incentive to get you on your way, whether it's threatening you in extreme cases or subtly intimidating you, or the fixed term leases or rent evictions. So we want to take away those incentives. If you take away the rent increase being tied to the tenant and tie it to the unit, that incentive to evict people and move them along is taken away. So that's very important, and hopefully we'll see change on that. There's also the geographic rent increase provision of the Residential Tenancy Act, which we'd just like to get rid of or revisit. Essentially, if you're lucky enough to be in a rental unit that is quite a bit before the average rent in your neighborhood, your landlord can go to the tenancy branch and say, this is I need the right to increase their rents more than 4%, because look, this building, for whatever historic reason, is well below the neighborhood. The residential tenancy branch is only supposed to grant these geographic rent increases in exceptional circumstances. But what we're saying as the tenants union is the whole city is kind of an exceptional circumstance right now. We'd like you to scrap this geographic rent increase provision that landlords can take advantage of. In Paris, they have a system where rents cannot exceed 20% of the area average. So there's some idea of looking at that here. Again, I'm not on the policy committee. I'm not sure how that would work, but Paris has some other things worth looking at. They have a huge new tax on vacant properties, and they also have a big Airbnb issue that they're trying to crack down on, and Vancouver needs to look into that as well. We'd also like to see anti-speculation measures put on properties. So if anyone buys and sells a house in the first year, Policy committee is saying there should be a 90% tax on the first year. Others have advocated a 50% in the first year. Well, at the rate property values are going up so much, you could pay 50% tax and almost still, you're still making money on it. So anyway, there needs to be some kind of stronger anti-speculation measures. We think it should be for properties flipped within 1 to 3 years, and it should be scaling down. So here they've suggested 90% in year one, maybe 90% in the first 6 months, or people who just literally close the deal and then flip it, and then it would scale down. So because after 3 years, you might actually be legitimately selling the property. The idea is if properties are being bought as flipping investments less, people who buy properties will actually rent them out and need that income because they're not just waiting to make the money on flipping it. Finally, we want to have capital gains on property sales, on the sale of primary residences, and apply the PST to the purchase of real property. So this is getting into pretty policy wonk territory, but there's all kinds of ways that profits off of property are not captured by the government. We also want to ensure all social housing is governed under the Residential Tenancy Act, provide translation for people who do not speak English at residential tenancy branches and hearings, raise the minimum wage. This is another aspect of it. Even if you freeze the rents, a lot of people at the wages we have and at the welfare rates we have in Vancouver can't afford what they call affordable housing. So as the Tenants Union, we also call for a higher minimum wage and higher social assistance rates. The other thing, we want the city and or the province together to pool money and buy out a lot of the SROs, the old kind of rooming houses and basically tenements, single rooms that people live in because those are the lowest rents in Vancouver, mostly in the downtown east side, but elsewhere as well. We think the government, and most of them are just falling into disrepair, and just, it's really, these are not conditions that people should be living in. Not only do you not have your own washroom, or often you don't have your own sufficient cooking area and kitchen, but you're just living in filth. Or the one that was shut down earlier this year, the Balmoral Hotel. Did people hear about this one? Before they shut it down and said you can't live here, they were actually telling tenants you can't use your bathtub or your shower because there's so much moisture damage and rotting of the wood under the bathrooms that if you have a bath, the floor might break, collapse. Yeah, you can actually. There are other horror stories where support beams in some of these SROs were rotting, and the tenants had to bring the city in and get the city to order these repairs done. The slumlords themselves were going to just allow their buildings to fall down. So we think if there's extreme cases of slumlords letting these buildings decay, the governments need to just find the money, buy them, fix them up, and give people, fix them up or knock them down and give people better homes. And then finally, we need 10,000 units of social housing a year. We actually need more affordable housing than just that, but we figure 10,000 social housing at actually affordable rates would make a big dent in things. But yeah, I want to leave some time because I like to hear your questions, and I have too much more to say. But I'm always looking for renters and tenants who have their own stories. It really educates us, and we're still in our infancy as a tenants union, and as you can see from my presentation, we're very grassroots and still all volunteer run. So we're looking for your input. We're looking for new members, and basically we're looking for new kind of coalitions to come together in Vancouver to make this a livable city. Just in the last 5 months since we've started the Tenants Union, it's sort of renewed my faith that our family can stay and live in Vancouver and be part of this city. But even in those 5 months where I've had this reason to feel optimistic, almost a handful of friends my age or younger who are thinking of starting families have moved either to New Westminster or in some cases further out. So I feel like friends are leaving town and family members are leaving town, and we just long term we want Vancouver to be a city where people people can stay. And yes, it's a desirable place to live, desirable climate, beautiful city, but it feels like these last years the heart has really been taken out of the city, and just too many people also who work here are being forced to move out of the city. This is the final point I guess I'll make, is that these issues around rental affordability and housing, they're not just housing issues. They're issues for the health of our whole society and the environment as well. Because, what kind of how can Vancouver, whose the city's official goal is to be the greenest city in the world, if everyone who works at jobs under $25 an hour has to live in Mission or Aldergrove or further? I have friends moving out to Chilliwack who still work here, and you ask them how they possibly do it. They say, oh, well, I only come into the office 3 days a week, and then I work from home 2 days a week. So yeah, how are you going to have a green city if people are commuting an hour and a half each way just to get into the city and work, including people who work at essential services and hospitals and transit workers. And these are workers that a city can't do without. They have to be able to afford to live in the city. So I'll leave it there for now, but thank you again to the Humanist Society for having me, Humanist Association for listening, and yeah, I want to hear your questions. Yeah.